In the winter of 1872, deep in the Adderstone Mountains where the pine trees stood like silent sentinels against endless white, a ledger sat open on a wooden desk. The wind shrieked through the gaps in the log walls, but inside the only sound was the scratch of a quill against yellowed paper. 97 names filled those pages, each entry marking another soul who had sought shelter from the killing cold. But only 6 bore the careful notation of departure. The Maynard Inn had been a beacon in those mountains, its windows glowing amber against the blue twilight of winter storms. Travelers desperate for warmth had stumbled through its doors, grateful for the promise of hot stew and dry beds. What they found instead was something far more horrifying than the blizzards they had fled. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury. The mathematics of survival are brutal in places where civilization grows thin. But the ledger of Maynard's Rest recorded more than simple hospitality. It documented a harvest. This was not just crime. This was an operation that fed on human lives through the longest, most merciless winter the mountains had ever known. The Adderstone Mountains rise like jagged teeth from the earth, their peaks lost in perpetual cloud, and their valleys carved deep by glacial ice that never fully retreats. For decades, the pass that wound through their heart had been the only practical route between the mining settlements of the east and the railroad towns spreading westward. It was a necessary evil, this treacherous path where the altitude stole breath and the weather turned murderous without warning. The trail itself was barely wide enough for a loaded wagon, carved into cliffsides that dropped away into darkness. Pine forests pressed close on both sides, their branches heavy with snow that could avalanche at the slightest disturbance. Local guides spoke of the pass in hushed tones, warning that storms could descend in minutes, transforming familiar landmarks into an alien wilderness of white. The Shoshone had avoided these heights for generations, calling them the place where the wind spirits went mad. But commerce demands passage, and men will risk death for profit. Miners hauled their fortunes in gold through these heights. Families seeking new lives in the territories beyond had no choice but to brave the crossing. Merchants with wagons full of goods gambled their livelihoods on reaching the other side before winter locked the pass entirely. Most made it through, some did not. The winter of 1871 brought snow earlier and heavier than anyone could remember. By October, drifts had already begun to block the lower sections of the trail. By November, the pass was navigable only during brief windows of clear weather. By December, even the most experienced guides refused to attempt the crossing, warning that the mountains had entered what they called the Long White, a season of endless storms that could last until spring. It was in this brutal landscape where civilization thinned to nothing and survival became a daily negotiation with death that the Maynard family had built their inn. Maynard's Rest sat at the highest navigable point of the pass, positioned to catch travelers just as exhaustion and desperation reached their peak. The building itself was unremarkable, a 2-story log structure with a steep roof designed to shed snow and small windows that glowed like eyes in the darkness. For those caught by sudden storms or nightfall in the high country, that light meant salvation, the warmth of a fire, the promise of hot food and a dry bed, safety from the wolves that howled in the darkness and the cold that could kill a man in his sleep. The inn's hand-painted sign, barely visible through the swirling snow, promised rest for the weary traveler. But the mountains keep their secrets well, and isolation breeds its own particular hungers. The Maynards had operated their inn for 3 winters before the Long White came to claim its harvest. To the few neighbors who lived within a day's ride, they seemed the very picture of frontier resilience. Hester Maynard, known to all as Granny, was a woman carved from the same granite as the mountains themselves. Her hands, weathered and strong from decades of hard labor, could knead bread, tend wounds, or wring a chicken's neck with equal efficiency. She stood barely 5 feet tall, but her presence filled any room she entered, her gray eyes sharp as winter stars and twice as cold. Her son Silas towered over her like a pine tree, his massive frame built for the brutal work of mountain living. He spoke little, preferring to communicate through nods and grunts, but his strength was legendary among the local trappers. Men said he could split a cord of wood in an hour, carry a full-grown elk on his shoulders, or break a man's neck with his bare hands if the need arose. His beard grew wild and unkempt, and his eyes held the distant look of someone who had seen too much of life's harsh realities. But it was Morwen who greeted the travelers at the door, and her smile could melt the ice from a man's beard. 23 years old, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the lamplight, she moved through the inn's common room like a ghost, her footsteps silent on the wooden floors. Her voice was soft as falling snow when she welcomed guests, offering them hot cider and asking gentle questions about their journey. Many a weary traveler found comfort in her presence, mistaking her ethereal beauty for kindness. The family claimed to have come from the eastern settlements, driven west by some unnamed tragedy that had left them with little more than their determination to survive. They had built the inn with their own hands, Silas felling the trees and Granny overseeing the construction, while Morwen tended a small garden that somehow flourished despite the harsh conditions. Local homesteaders respected their self-reliance, though they noted something peculiar about the family's isolation. Sister Agnes, a missionary who traveled the mountain communities bringing religious comfort to the scattered faithful, had attempted to visit the Maynards in the spring of 1871. Her diary entry from that day reveals a telling encounter. She wrote that she had ridden to the inn hoping to deliver gospel books and perhaps share a meal with fellow Christians, but the family would not allow her past the front porch, claiming they were too busy with repairs to receive visitors properly. What troubled Sister Agnes was not their refusal, but the atmosphere of barely contained tension that seemed to surround the family. Granny Hester's smile never reached her eyes, she noted, and when the old woman spoke, her words came measured and careful, as if each one was weighed before being released. Silas remained in the background, watching the missionary with the intensity of a predator, studying potential prey. But it was Morwen who disturbed Sister Agnes most profoundly. The young woman's beauty was undeniable, but her eyes held a hollow quality that spoke of terrible knowledge. When she smiled, it was the expression of someone who had forgotten what genuine joy felt like. Sister Agnes wrote that she felt an overwhelming urge to take the girl's hands and pray for her soul, sensing some deep corruption that had taken root in her spirit. But Morwen kept her distance, speaking only when spoken to and always with that same distant, haunting smile. The missionary left that day with a profound sense of unease, though she could not articulate exactly what had disturbed her so deeply. She made a note in her diary to return before winter, perhaps with the local sheriff, to check on the family's welfare. That return visit never came. By autumn, Sister Agnes had been reassigned to missions further south, and the Maynards remained alone in their mountain fastness. Local trappers and hunters occasionally stopped at the inn during their travels, and their accounts painted a picture of a family perfectly adapted to their harsh environment. The inn was always warm, they said, with fires burning in both the common room and the guest quarters. The food was hearty and plentiful, featuring game stews and fresh bread that seemed impossibly abundant for such a remote location. Granny Hester ran the establishment with military precision, while Silas handled the heavy work and Morwen served as the gracious hostess. But even these visitors noticed peculiarities. The inn's root cellar was off limits to guests, kept locked with a heavy iron bolt. The family's greenhouse, which somehow produced fresh vegetables through the harshest winters, was also forbidden territory, and there was something about the way the Maynards watched their guests, a calculating quality to their hospitality that made even hardened mountain men slightly uncomfortable. They were a perfect picture of frontier resilience, this family who had carved a life from the wilderness through sheer determination and hard work. But resilience can curdle into something else entirely when it encounters the weight of true desperation. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of Jedediah Clark, a traveling peddler who made his living hauling goods between the mining camps and the settlements below. Clark was known throughout the high country as a reliable man, steady in his habits and meticulous in his record-keeping. He traveled with a single pack mule loaded with everything from bullets to buttons, medicines to mirrors, all the small necessities that kept frontier life bearable. On the 15th of October, 1871, Clark had checked into Maynard's Rest just as the first serious snow of the season began to fall. The inn's ledger shows his name, written in Morwen's careful script, along with a notation that his mule was stabled in the barn with feed and water. Local trappers later recalled seeing smoke rising from the inn's chimney that evening, and the warm glow of lamplight in the windows suggested a comfortable night's lodging for the weary peddler. But the next morning brought an unseasonable thaw, and the pass cleared enough for travel. Clark, ever mindful of his schedule and the approaching winter, should have been on the trail before dawn. Instead, the inn remained silent. No smoke rose from its chimney, no tracks led away from the building save for the wandering paths of the Maynard family as they went about their morning chores. When questioned later by Sheriff Josiah Hale, Granny Hester claimed that Clark had indeed departed before sunrise, eager to reach the lower elevations before another storm struck. She produced his payment, silver coins that she said he had left on the dresser in his room. But there were inconsistencies in her story that troubled those who knew Clark's methods. The peddler always collected payment in person, preferring to count his coins and secure them in his money belt before setting foot outside any establishment. More disturbing was the matter of the pack mule. Silas claimed the animal had wandered off during the night, breaking free from the barn and vanishing into the forest. Such things happened in the mountains where wild predators might spook livestock into fleeing, but Clark's mule was an old, steady beast, trained to stay close to shelter and unlikely to bolt without good reason. Sheriff Hale recorded the incident in his ledger as a missing person complaint, though his investigation proved perfunctory at best. The distances were vast, the weather unpredictable, and men did disappear in the high country with troubling regularity. Without a body or clear evidence of foul play, there was little the law could do except file the report and hope that Clark might turn up in some distant settlement alive and well. But the local trappers noticed something peculiar in the days following Clark's disappearance. The Maynard's dogs, a pack of half-wild mongrels that normally scavenged for scraps and hunted small game in the forest, seemed uncommonly well fed. Their coats grew glossy, their bellies full, and they showed little interest in their usual foraging. Jeremiah Pike, a trapper who knew the animals' habits, remarked to his brother in a letter that the dogs acted like creatures who had stumbled upon an unexpected bounty. Pike also noted that the smoke rising from the inn's chimney carried an unusual scent during those October days. Not the clean smell of burning pine or the savory aroma of cooking game, but something heavier and more complex. He described it as reminiscent of a barber's shop during fever season, that peculiar mixture of rendered fat and burned hair that spoke of processes better left unexamined. The mystery of Jedediah Clark might have faded into the collection of unsolved disappearances that plagued the mountain communities, just another casualty of the brutal frontier life. But in the months that followed, as the Long White tightened its grip on the high country, other travelers would find their way to Maynard's Rest, and the pattern that began with one missing peddler would repeat itself with horrifying consistency. It was easy to dismiss one missing man in country where death stalked every trail, but a pattern requires multiple points, and the winter of 1872 would provide far more data than anyone could have imagined. The winter that would become known as the Long White began in earnest during the final week of November 1871. The storms arrived with a violence that caught even experienced mountain dwellers off guard, dropping temperatures to levels that could freeze spit before it hit the ground and burying familiar landmarks under drifts that reached second-story windows. The Adderstone Pass, already treacherous under the best conditions, became a corridor of death where even the most desperate travelers feared to venture. But desperation has its own mathematics, and the lure of fortune drives men to attempt the impossible. The mining camps scattered throughout the eastern slopes had produced their richest yields that autumn, and the promise of reaching railroad towns before spring meant the difference between prosperity and ruin for many. Families fleeing failed homesteads in the territories beyond saw the pass as their only route to salvation, even as the weather conspired to trap them in the high country. The inn's ledger tells the story in stark, simple entries. Names appeared with increasing frequency as November gave way to December, each one representing a soul who had gambled their life against the mountain's fury. Thomas Brennan, a merchant from Denver hauling a wagon load of mining equipment. The Kowalski family, Polish immigrants with 3 small children seeking passage to the California valleys. Samuel Wright, a former Union soldier carrying dispatches between territorial governments. Each entry follows the same pattern, a check-in date carefully recorded in Morwen's elegant script. Notations about livestock stabled, belongings stored, meals provided, but no departure dates. The ledger reads like a roster of the damned, a catalog of lives suspended between arrival and oblivion. What drew these travelers to Maynard's Rest was not merely the promise of shelter, but the complete absence of alternatives. The next closest accommodation lay more than 30 miles down the treacherous mountain road, a distance that might as well have been 300 when the storm struck. The inn's position at the highest navigable point of the pass meant that anyone caught by darkness or weather had no choice but to seek its warmth or perish in the snow. Morwen had perfected her role as the welcoming hostess. Her pale beauty and soft voice, a stark contrast to the howling wilderness outside. Travelers spoke later of how she would appear at the door before they had even finished unhitching their horses, as if she possessed some supernatural ability to sense approaching guests. Her smile promised safety and comfort. Her gentle questions about their journey suggested genuine concern for their welfare. The common room of the inn was designed to reinforce this illusion of sanctuary. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows that made the space feel alive and welcoming. Heavy wooden tables bore the scars of countless meals, their surfaces polished smooth by years of use. The air carried the mingled scents of wood smoke and cooking food, aromas that spoke to the most primitive human need for warmth and sustenance. But it was the policy of the inn that sealed the traveler's fate. Granny Hester, with her practical frontier wisdom, insisted that guests remain until the weather cleared sufficiently for safe travel. This was presented as simple mountain hospitality, a reasonable precaution that had saved countless lives over the years. Who could argue with such logic when the alternative was death in a blizzard? The locked doors that secured the inn each night were explained as protection against wild animals and the bitter cold. The heavy bolt that sealed the main entrance, the barred windows that prevented drafts, the policy of collecting weapons for safekeeping, All were reasonable measures in a place where survival depended on maintaining strict control over resources and security. Days would pass in this enforced comfort while storms raged outside. Guests found themselves part of an extended family of stranded travelers, sharing meals and stories while waiting for nature to relent. The Maynards proved to be attentive hosts, ensuring that no one wanted for food or warmth. Morwen moved among the guests like a ministering angel, always ready with a cup of mulled wine or a sympathetic ear for tales of hardship. But as the days stretched into weeks, some guests began to notice peculiarities. The inn's remarkable abundance of food, despite its isolation from supply lines. The fact that other guests seemed to vanish during the night, their rooms emptied and their belongings mysteriously relocated. The way conversation stopped whenever one of the Maynards entered a room, as if the family's presence carried some unspoken threat. For the guests, the inn represented salvation from the merciless cold and the promise of eventual passage to their destinations. For the Maynards, each new arrival was inventory walking through their door, resources that would sustain them through the brutal months ahead. The mathematics of survival had taken on a grotesque new meaning in the isolation of the high country. What investigators would later discover in the abandoned inn was not the chaotic aftermath of random violence, but evidence of a system so methodical it bordered on industrial. The Maynards had not merely killed their guests. They had developed a process for harvesting them with the same efficiency that other frontier families might butcher livestock. Every aspect of their operation was designed for maximum utility and minimum waste, a testament to the practical ingenuity that desperation can inspire. The mechanism began with the inn's construction itself. Each guest room was equipped with a weighted floorboard positioned directly beside the bed, so subtle in its engineering that even the most suspicious visitor would never notice the slight depression when they stepped upon it. This pressure plate was connected through a system of pulleys and wires to a series of bells mounted in the family's private quarters, allowing the Maynards to monitor exactly when each guest retired for the evening. Morwen's role extended far beyond simple hospitality. She had perfected the art of the welcome drink, offering each arriving guest a cup of mulled wine or hot cider laced with enough laudanum to render them unconscious within minutes of consumption. The drug was administered with practiced precision, enough to ensure complete helplessness without causing immediate death. The Maynards needed their inventory alive until processing could begin. Once the bells signaled that a guest had retired and the drugged beverage had taken effect, Silas would enter the room with the silent efficiency of a predator. His massive strength made the task of moving unconscious bodies trivial, and his knowledge of anatomy, learned through years of butchering game animals, served him well in more gruesome applications. The guests were transported not to some hidden grave in the forest, but to the inn's basement where the true horror of the operation awaited. The basement had been transformed into what could only be described as a charnel house, its walls lined with white ceramic tiles that could be easily cleaned and sanitized. Drainage channels carved into the floor directed fluids toward a central collection point, while hooks suspended from the ceiling beams provided the means for systematic processing. The clinical efficiency of the space spoke to months of careful planning and refinement. But it was the discovered ledgers that revealed the full scope of the Maynards' enterprise. Alongside the guest registry, investigators found detailed inventory records documenting the yield from each victim. Weight measurements, tissue quality assessments, and processing notes were recorded with the same meticulous care that a legitimate butcher might use to track livestock. The family had even developed a classification system, rating their victims based on age, health, and body composition. If you're still watching at this point, hit that subscribe button and the bell icon, because what comes next reveals the depths of human depravity that most people cannot even imagine. The processing itself followed established patterns learned from generations of frontier survival. Meat was smoked and salted, using techniques passed down through mountain families, ensuring preservation through the harsh winter months. But the Maynards had expanded this knowledge to accommodate their unique circumstances, developing methods for rendering human fat into lard, processing organs into sausages, and even grinding bones into fertilizer for their impossibly productive greenhouse. Nothing was wasted in this grotesque economy. Hair was collected and used for stuffing mattresses and pillows, ensuring that the inn's accommodations remained comfortable for future guests. Clothing and personal effects were carefully catalogued and stored, to be sold later at distant settlements where no questions would be asked about their origins. Even the victims' livestock and wagons were incorporated into the operation, providing additional resources and eliminating evidence of their owner's presence. The greenhouse represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire enterprise. Fed with fertilizer rendered from human remains, it produced fresh vegetables throughout the winter months in quantities that seemed miraculous to neighboring settlers. The Maynards had created a closed-loop system where their victims literally nourished the food that would be served to future guests, creating a cycle of consumption that transformed the inn into something resembling a Venus flytrap designed for human prey. Supply records discovered in the inn's office revealed the true scale of the operation. Massive quantities of salt, smoking chips, and preservatives had been purchased from distant suppliers, far exceeding what any legitimate inn would require. Bills of lading showed deliveries of industrial-scale butchering equipment, ceramic tiles, and specialized drainage materials that served no purpose in normal hospitality operations. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of what appeared to be practice runs. A child's slate found in the family's quarters contained arithmetic problems that calculated yield ratios and processing times with mathematical precision. The problems read like grotesque word puzzles. If one guest yields 50 pounds of usable material, how many guests would be needed to produce 1,000 pounds? The education of the next generation had included lessons in human resource management of the most literal kind. The system was perfect in its horrible efficiency, a closed ecosystem where every element served multiple purposes. The inn attracted victims, the isolation prevented escape, the weather provided cover for extended processing times, and the resulting product sustained the family while eliminating evidence. It was, in its own twisted way, a masterpiece of frontier self-reliance taken to its logical extreme. But perfection, even in the service of evil, remains vulnerable to the unexpected variable. And in the person of Dr. Alistair Vance, the Maynards would encounter a guest whose training had prepared him to recognize exactly what he was being served. Dr. Alistair Vance arrived at Maynard's Rest on the 20th of February, 1872, stumbling through the doorway with his medical bag clutched against his chest. He had been traveling from Silverton to attend a difficult childbirth when the blizzard caught him in the high country. Like so many before him, he found himself grateful for the warm glow of windows and the promise of shelter from the killing wind. Vance was a man of science, trained in anatomy at Harvard Medical College and seasoned by years of frontier practice. His education had required countless hours studying human anatomy, dissecting cadavers with methodical precision. This knowledge, which had saved lives in his medical practice, would prove to be his salvation at the inn. Morwen greeted him with customary grace, taking his coat and offering him a seat by the fire. The common area held perhaps a dozen other travelers, all stranded by the storm. They seemed a typical collection of frontier wanderers, but Vance noticed something troubling in their collective demeanor. The guests moved with the listless quality of people confined too long conversations dying whenever the Maynards entered the room. When Morwen returned with his welcome cup of mulled cider, Vance accepted it gratefully, but as he raised the cup to his lips, his medical training asserted itself. The aroma carried a subtle note that didn't belong, a bitter undertone his pharmaceutical knowledge identified as laudanum. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Laudanum had no place in a social drink unless the intention was sedation. Vance forced himself to maintain composure, pretending to sip while barely wetting his lips. Instead, he engaged Morwen in conversation about the other guests and their stays. Her answers only deepened his alarm. Several guests had supposedly been there for weeks, but when he quietly questioned these residents, their stories didn't align. Worse, when he asked about recently departed guests, he was met with confused stares and nervous glances. That evening's dinner provided the evidence that transformed suspicion into certainty. The meal was hearty frontier fare, a thick stew rich with meat and vegetables. Vance ate cautiously, his medical training making him hyper-aware of textures and flavors. Most of the meat appeared to be venison or elk, typical game that sustained mountain communities. But midway through the meal, his fork encountered a piece of gristle that made him pause. The texture was wrong, too smooth for wild game. When he examined it closely in the lamplight, his anatomical knowledge provided a horrifying identification. The tissue structure, the grain of the meat, the way it separated when pressed with his knife, all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. He was looking at pectoralis major, the large chest muscle that no four-legged animal possessed. The piece of meat sat on his fork like an accusation, undeniable evidence of the inn's true nature. Vance had dissected enough human cadavers to recognize the tissue with absolute certainty. This was human flesh, prepared and served with the same efficiency that characterized everything else about the inn's operation. Fighting to control his revulsion, Vance forced himself to finish the meal while his mind raced through the implications. The disappeared guests had not departed for distant destinations. They had become ingredients in the very stew he was consuming. The inn's abundant food supply, the greenhouse's impossible productivity, the family's strange behavior, all of it suddenly made horrific sense. Knowledge brought its own dangers. His survival depended on maintaining the pretense of ignorance while finding escape. The other guests continued eating with apparent appetite, either unaware of what they consumed or too frightened to acknowledge the truth. Vance realized he was surrounded not just by cannibals, but by their victims in waiting. That night, pleading stomach distress, he avoided Morwen's offer of medicinal drink and retired to his room intending to stay awake. The weighted floorboard compressed with a faint click, and somewhere in the depths, he heard the corresponding chime of a bell. The sound filled him with dread, for he understood it was not a call to service, but a death knell marking another soul ready for harvest. In the darkness, listening to wind outside and footsteps in the corridor, Dr. Vance knew he faced a choice between certain death and slim possibility of escape into a blizzard that might kill him just as surely. But he had seen enough of the Maynards' hospitality to know that staying meant becoming tomorrow's main course. Dr. Vance's escape from Maynard's Rest would be described as miraculous, a testament to desperation and divine providence. Using his medical knowledge, he had managed to simulate laudanum poisoning, slowing his breathing to convince Silas the drug had taken hold. When the giant entered his room near midnight, Vance remained motionless as hands lifted him toward the basement. But Vance was conscious, and when Silas paused to unlock the basement door, the doctor broke free with frenzied strength. The struggle was brief but violent, ending when Vance struck Silas in the temple with a brass candlestick. The blow stunned the larger man long enough for Vance to flee into the howling wilderness. The doctor's flight lasted 3 days, a nightmare journey through waist-deep snow and killing temperatures. He survived by following creek beds, eating pine bark and melting snow, driven forward by knowledge that returning meant death. When he staggered into Copper Creek, frostbitten and half-mad with exposure, his story was initially dismissed as cold-induced ravings. But Sheriff Josiah Hale was careful, paying attention to details others dismissed. Vance's account contained too many specific elements to be hallucination. The doctor's description of the inn's layout, his knowledge of the family members, and most disturbing, his anatomically precise identification of human tissue, all suggested horrible truth. On February 28th, as weather cleared, Hale assembled a posse of 12 men and set out for Maynard's Rest. The journey took 2 days through treacherous conditions, but the sheriff was driven by growing certainty that he faced something far worse than routine mountain disappearances. What they found was silence more profound than death itself. The inn stood empty, doors hanging open to reveal rooms stripped of personal belongings but still furnished with frontier necessities. Snow had blown through doorways, covering floors with pristine white carpet, bearing only the investigating party's footprints. The guest ledger lay open on the reception desk, pages fluttering in wind that whistled through broken windows. Sheriff Hale studied entries with growing horror, counting 97 names with check-in dates but only 6 with departure notations. The handwriting changed subtly throughout months, beginning with Morwen's elegant script but deteriorating into something frantic and hurried. The basement provided the most damning evidence. Tiled walls were recently scrubbed with lye, strong enough to burn nostrils. Drainage channels led to a central collection point bearing dark stains despite cleaning attempts. Meat hooks hung from ceiling beams, and knives and saws lay abandoned on a wooden table, their blades bearing traces that made hardened mountain men turn away in revulsion. The greenhouse told its own horror story. Soil was rich and dark, fertilized with bone meal ground fine as flour. Vegetables grew in impossible abundance despite harsh winter, their roots drawing sustenance from what Hale grimly suspected was not animal remains. A grinding wheel held fragments of what appeared to be human bone. Most disturbing was the ash pile behind the inn, where the Maynards had burned evidence before fleeing. Among charred debris, the posse discovered metal buttons, belt buckles, and clothing fragments that survived flames. The discovery of teeth and bone fragments confirmed their worst fears about the inn's operations. The Maynards had vanished as completely as their victims, leaving only evidence of systematic harvest of human lives. Personal belongings were gone, suggesting planned evacuation rather than panic. Even livestock had disappeared, taken to sustain them during escape into trackless wilderness. Sheriff Hale's official report documented evidence of multiple homicides, though he avoided graphic descriptions that might inflame public sentiment. The inn was sealed and abandoned, left to elements and gradual decay that claims all human constructions in the unforgiving mountains. The birds had flown, but they left behind their ledger of human misery and physical evidence of crimes that defied comprehension. It was Elias Finch, the county clerk and amateur genealogist, whose uncle had disappeared somewhere in the high country during the winter of 1872, who would piece together the true scope of the Maynards' enterprise. Working from the abandoned inn's guest ledger and cross-referencing it with supply records recovered from the family's private quarters, Finch constructed a mathematical proof of horror that left no room for doubt or denial. The guest registry told its story in stark numerical terms. Between October of 1871 and February of 1872, 97 individuals had checked into Maynard's Rest. The entries showed a steady increase in frequency as winter deepened, with November recording 18 arrivals, December 23, and January 31. February had seen 25 names added before Dr. Vance's escape ended the inn's operations. But when Finch examined the supply records that Sheriff Hale's men had discovered in the inn's office, a disturbing pattern emerged. The Maynards had purchased almost no food from outside suppliers during the months when they were supposedly feeding nearly 100 guests. A typical frontier inn hosting such numbers would require massive deliveries of flour, preserved meat, dried beans, and other staples to sustain operations through the harsh winter months. Instead, the bills of lading showed purchases that painted a very different picture of the inn's true business. In September of 1871, just before the killing season began, Silas had arranged for the delivery of 200 pounds of salt, 50 gallons of lard, and industrial quantities of smoking chips and preservatives. These were not the supplies of a hospitality business, but the materials needed for large-scale meat processing and preservation. The mathematics were incontrovertible. Based on the quantities of preservatives purchased and the documented efficiency of frontier butchering practices, Finch calculated that the Maynards had processed approximately 4,000 pounds of meat during the winter months. Yet their purchase records showed the acquisition of no livestock beyond a few chickens and a milk cow, animals that could not possibly account for such massive quantities of preserved flesh. More damning still was the evidence from the inn's miraculous greenhouse. Neighboring homesteaders had marveled at the Maynards' ability to produce fresh vegetables throughout the brutal winter, attributing their success to superior farming techniques or divine blessing. But the supply records revealed massive purchases of bone meal fertilizer, quantities that far exceeded what any legitimate farming operation would require. Finch's investigation uncovered bills for grinding equipment that had no place in normal inn operations. Industrial-scale meat grinders, bone crushers, and rendering apparatus had been delivered to Maynard's Rest throughout the autumn months, ostensibly for processing game animals, but the sheer volume of this equipment suggested operations on a scale that dwarfed any reasonable hunting activities. The county clerk also discovered correspondence with distant mercantile establishments, letters inquiring about the sale of personal effects, clothing, and jewelry in quantities that suggested the liquidation of dozens of individuals' belongings. The Maynards had been methodical in disposing of their victims' possessions, spreading sales across multiple settlements to avoid suspicion while converting stolen goods into operating capital. Perhaps most chilling was Finch's discovery of what appeared to be practice calculations in the margins of supply invoices. Someone in the Maynard family had been working out yield ratios, determining how much usable material could be extracted from victims of various sizes and conditions. The arithmetic was coldly practical, treating human beings as livestock to be processed with maximum efficiency. The financial records painted a picture of a business that had found a grotesque solution to the economic challenges of frontier hospitality. Rather than struggling to feed guests through the expensive winter months, the Maynards had converted their visitors into the very resources needed to sustain operations. It was a closed-loop system of horrifying efficiency, where each new arrival not only paid for their accommodation, but literally became part of the inn's food supply. Finch's analysis also revealed the seasonal nature of the operation. The purchasing patterns showed that the Maynards had been preparing for their harvest months in advance, stockpiling preservation materials and processing equipment in anticipation of the winter-trapped travelers. This was not spontaneous cannibalism born of desperation, but a calculated business model that treated murder as a form of resource management. The clerk's mathematical proof extended beyond mere supply analysis. By cross-referencing the guest ledger with territorial records of missing persons, he was able to confirm that the vast majority of the inn's visitors had indeed vanished without trace. Families had stopped receiving letters, business partners had lost contact, and entire wagon trains had simply disappeared into the mountain passes without explanation. The weight of mathematical evidence was overwhelming. The inputs did not match the outputs in any scenario, except one where the guests themselves had become the primary resource sustaining the inn's operations. Finch's careful calculations had transformed suspicion into certainty, providing numerical proof of systematic murder on a scale that challenged comprehension. In his final report to territorial authorities, Finch wrote that the Maynard family had operated what could only be described as a human abattoir, processing their victims with the same methodical efficiency that legitimate businesses applied to livestock. The mathematics of survival had been perverted into something monstrous, an equation where hospitality equaled death and guests became inventory in the most literal sense possible. The reconstruction of the Maynard family's final hours required Sheriff Hale's investigators to piece together evidence from overturned furniture, hastily packed belongings, and signs of immediate evacuation. What emerged was a picture of methodical criminals executing an escape plan they had likely rehearsed for exactly such an emergency. Dr. Vance's escape occurred during the early morning hours of February 25th, but the Maynards did not flee immediately. Evidence suggested they spent the remainder of that day destroying incriminating materials and preparing for departure. The ash pile contained not only victims' personal effects, but business correspondence, supply invoices, and detailed operational records hastily committed to flame. Granny Hester had overseen evidence destruction with the same systematic efficiency that characterized the family's enterprise. Kitchen utensils used in processing victims were thrown into the fire, their metal handles warped by heat, but still recognizable as implements of butchery. Blood-stained clothing had been burned, though fabric fragments survived in the ash to tell their grim story. Silas had undertaken the most physically demanding evacuation tasks. The basement processing facility had been scrubbed with industrial amounts of lye, eliminating forensic evidence that might connect the family to their crimes. Drainage channels were flushed repeatedly, ceramic tiles scoured until they gleamed white as fresh snow. Even meat hooks were removed from ceiling mounts, leaving only iron anchors in wooden beams. Morwen's role involved systematic inventory and packing of valuable items to sustain the family during flight. Silver coins from guest payments, jewelry and personal effects for sale, portable goods representing accumulated wealth from months of murder and theft. She also prepared limited supplies they could carry into wilderness, selecting preserved foods and warm clothing. The timing of departure could be reconstructed from evidence left behind. A half-eaten meal sat abandoned on the kitchen table, suggesting interruption during dinner preparations. The guest ledger remained open to Dr. Vance's entry, as if Morwen had been recording notation when the decision to flee was made. Even fires in common room and guest quarters were left burning, flames eventually consuming the inn's interior. Most telling was what they chose to abandon. The inn's furniture, built with their own hands and representing years of labor, was left without sentiment. The greenhouse that provided miraculous harvests was left to freeze, carefully tended plants doomed to die. Even livestock was simply turned loose to fend for itself in mountain wilderness. But they took their weapons. The gun rack stood empty, ammunition stores cleaned out completely. This suggested they expected dangers during flight requiring armed defense, whether from pursuing lawmen or predators that stalked the high country during winter. Physical evidence painted a picture of 3 figures setting out into a blizzard that had claimed experienced mountain men. Fresh snowfall covered tracks within hours, but their direction could be inferred from undisturbed areas around the inn. They had not taken the main trail toward settlements, choosing instead to strike out cross-country into trackless wilderness of the high peaks. Weather records documented one of the most severe blizzards in mountain memory, with temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes and winds strong enough to blind travelers with driving snow. For the Maynards to venture into such conditions suggested they viewed the storm as preferable to facing territorial justice. The coroner's examination of bone fragments found in the ash pile provided a final chilling detail. Dr. Erasmus Webb reported that fragments included teeth and finger bones, showing evidence of deliberate breakage, suggesting the Maynards had destroyed even these small remnants rather than leave evidence that might identify the dead. In choosing to face certain death in mountain wilderness rather than possible capture, the Maynards made a calculation that spoke to the magnitude of their crimes. They knew discovery meant not just imprisonment, but likely execution for murders so heinous they defied public understanding. The blizzard that swallowed them was the same storm that had driven so many travelers to seek shelter at their inn. The weather that provided victims had become their final judge, jury, and executioner. They chose mountain death over human justice, vanishing into white silence that had claimed so many of their guests. Among the most disturbing discoveries in Elias Finch's analysis of the Maynard Inn ledger were the 6 names bearing departure dates, supposed survivors who had somehow escaped the fate of 91 others. These entries had represented hope in an otherwise hopeless catalog of death, suggesting not every soul who entered Maynard's Rest had perished in its tiled basement. But closer examination revealed that even these apparent survivors were likely nothing more than accounting tricks in a ledger of lies. The first inconsistency emerged when Finch attempted to trace the 6 individuals through territorial records. 3 names, Marcus Webb, Jonathan Harrow, and Samuel Crenshaw, appeared nowhere in birth records, land grants, or business licenses. Their names were common enough to be believable, but their complete absence from official documentation suggested they had never existed at all. More suspicious was the timing of their supposed departures. All 6 checkout dates occurred during periods of documented severe weather, when even experienced mountain guides refused passage through the Adderstone Pass. The idea that travelers would venture into killing blizzards rather than remain in inn comfort defied both logic and frontier common sense. Handwriting analysis provided the most damning evidence of deception. While check-in dates for the 6 names were written in Morwen's characteristic elegant script, departure notations appeared to be added later in a different hand entirely. Under magnification, the ink showed subtle differences in composition and flow, suggesting different writing instruments at different times. The 4th supposed survivor, Margaret Whitmore, presented particularly troubling inconsistencies. Her check-in date placed her at the inn during January storms, yet her departure was recorded for a day when weather records documented temperatures of 40 degrees below zero and winds strong enough to topple trees. The idea that a woman traveling alone would attempt such a journey stretched credibility beyond reasonable limits. Finch's investigation revealed geographical impossibilities in departure records. 2 supposed survivors were recorded as leaving for destinations requiring travel through impassable winter terrain. The settlements they claimed to be reaching had been snowed in for weeks, with no recorded arrivals matching their descriptions during relevant time periods. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of apparent forgery practice attempts among the Maynards' personal papers. Scraps bearing different versions of departure entries were found in the inn's office, suggesting someone had been experimenting with ways to create believable records of guest departures without actually allowing anyone to leave alive. The mathematical pattern of false entries revealed their deceptive nature. The 6 supposed departures were spaced at regular intervals throughout the killing season, creating an impression of normalcy that might satisfy casual inspection while avoiding complete absence of departure records that would have immediately aroused suspicion. Further investigation revealed that the supposed survivors' names corresponded to individuals who had died in distant settlements during the previous year. Their deaths recorded in territorial newspapers the Maynards could have accessed. The family had apparently harvested names from obituaries, recycling deceased identities to create fictional guests who could safely depart without contradiction from living witnesses. The most damaging revelation came when Finch discovered that departure entry handwriting matched samples of Granny Hester's script found in business correspondence. The old woman had been methodically creating false records, backdating departure entries to maintain the illusion that some guests survived their stay at Maynard's Rest. This systematic falsification served multiple purposes. It created the appearance of normal inn operations for any official who might inquire about missing travelers. It provided ready explanations for absent individuals without requiring the family to account for bodies or belongings. Most insidiously, it maintained hope among remaining guests that departure was possible, keeping them compliant while awaiting their turn in the basement. The realization that even these supposed survivors were fabrications transformed Maynard's Rest from tragedy to absolute nightmare. There had been no exceptions to the family's harvest, no mercy shown regardless of age, gender, or circumstance. Every soul who entered during winter 1872 met the same fate in the systematic machinery of death the Maynards had perfected. The ledger was not a record of hospitality punctuated by occasional survival, but a comprehensive catalog of murder disguised as business records. The ledger itself had become part of the machine, a tool for managing both the harvest of human lives and concealment of evidence. The territorial government's response to the Maynard Inn atrocities revealed the uncomfortable truth that some horrors are too vast for official acknowledgement. Despite Sheriff Hale's detailed reports and Elias Finch's mathematical proof of systematic murder, the case was quietly buried beneath layers of bureaucratic indifference and political calculation. Governor William Crawford, facing re-election and mindful of the territory's reputation among potential investors, classified the Maynard investigation under territorial security provisions. This designation effectively sealed the case files and prevented newspaper coverage that might damage the region's prospects for statehood. The governor's private correspondence revealed his concern that publicizing such extreme criminal behavior might discourage migration and harm economic development. The official inquest, conducted in April 1872, concluded that the Maynard family had been responsible for an unspecified number of deaths during winter months, with the exact count deliberately left vague to avoid sensational headlines. The report attributed the crimes to frontier desperation and severe weather conditions, portraying the murders as tragic but isolated incidents rather than the systematic operation investigators had uncovered. Sheriff Hale found himself under pressure from territorial administrators to minimize his public statements. His detailed reports were edited heavily before filing, with references to processing equipment, bone meal fertilizer, and systematic operations removed entirely. The sheriff's private journal recorded his frustration with officials who seemed more concerned with public relations than justice for victims. Physical evidence from the inn was systematically destroyed rather than preserved. The guest ledger, which might have served as a permanent memorial to victims, was burned on orders from the territorial attorney general. Processing equipment discovered in the basement was removed and disposed of in a remote mountain location. Even the inn's building was deliberately allowed to deteriorate, with no effort made to preserve the site for historical documentation. Local newspapers were discouraged from investigating through official pressure and economic incentives. Publishers were reminded of their dependence on territorial government printing contracts and advertising revenue from businesses seeking to attract settlers. Journalists who attempted to pursue the story found sources suddenly unwilling to speak and access to official records blocked by administrative delays. The fate of Dr. Vance, the sole surviving witness, illustrated the government's determination to control the narrative. Rather than being celebrated as a hero whose courage exposed the crimes, Vance found himself subjected to official scrutiny and pressure to moderate his public statements. His medical practice suffered as territorial administrators questioned his mental stability and reliability as a witness. Within 6 months, the official story had been reduced to a brief mention in territorial records describing the disappearance of several travelers during severe winter weather and the subsequent abandonment of a remote inn. The systematic nature of murders, industrial scale of operations, and exact number of victims were all omitted from the sanitized account that entered historical record. The Maynard Inn case became a cautionary example of how political considerations could override justice and historical accuracy. Territorial officials concerned more with economic development than honoring victim memory chose to bury truth rather than confront the implications of such systematic evil occurring within their jurisdiction. But mountain communities remembered what official records chose to forget. Stories of the inn were passed down through oral tradition among trappers, miners, and settlers who understood that some truths are too dangerous for governments to acknowledge. The sanitized historical record might claim ignorance, but people who lived in the shadow of the Adderstone Mountains knew exactly what had happened during winter 1872. The record was wiped clean by those who valued reputation over remembrance, but the mountain itself remained as witness to crimes that defied both comprehension and official acknowledgement. More than a century and a half after the last guest checked into Maynard's Rest, the ruins still draw those compelled by humanity's darkest chapters. Modern hikers who brave the treacherous trails report an atmosphere of unnatural silence, as if the mountain itself holds its breath in the presence of concentrated evil. The inn's foundation stones, scattered and overgrown with mountain laurel, mark where hospitality was perverted into systematic murder. Urban explorers have documented strange artifacts that surface around the ruins after heavy rains or snowmelt. Fragments of ceramic tile, buttons that match no known manufacturer from the 1870s, and pieces of rusted metal that might once have been processing equipment emerge from the soil like accusations from the grave. Each discovery serves as reminder that the earth preserves evidence of crimes official records chose to erase. The most disturbing finds are personal items that belonged to victims: a child's toy horse carved from wood, a woman's brass locket containing photographs of unknown faces, a man's pocket watch stopped forever at 11:43. These remnants of interrupted lives speak to the human cost of the Maynard's enterprise with more power than any official documentation. Local folklore has transformed the site into something approaching a shrine to frontier justice, though visitors approach with reverence typically reserved for battlefields and cemeteries. The mountain community has never forgotten what happened during winter 1872, and stories of the inn are still passed down through generations who understand that some histories are too important to be left to official records. Modern true crime researchers have attempted to verify the exact number of victims by cross-referencing missing person reports with territorial migration records, but documentation loss makes precise accounting impossible. What remains clear is that the Maynard Inn represents one of the most systematic examples of serial murder in American frontier history, a calculated enterprise that treated human life as renewable resource. Contemporary analysis suggests Granny Hester Maynard possessed the organizational skills and ruthless pragmatism of a successful business entrepreneur, channeled into unthinkable horror. Modern criminologists have noted parallels to other family-based criminal enterprises, where isolation and shared guilt create closed systems that operate for extended periods without detection. Perhaps most chilling is the realization that the Maynard's methods could be replicated in modern contexts where vulnerable populations remain isolated from oversight. The case serves as a reminder that systematic evil requires only opportunity, isolation, and complete abandonment of human empathy. Contemporary visitors often report experiencing what can only be described as psychic weight, an oppressive sense of accumulated suffering that seems to emanate from the stones themselves. Whether this represents genuine supernatural phenomena or the power of historical knowledge to shape perception remains a matter of individual interpretation. The story refuses to die because the fear it represents is eternal. The recognition that beneath civilization's veneer lies capacity for systematic evil that can emerge whenever conditions allow. The snows still come to the high country every winter, and somewhere in trackless wilderness the possibility of similar horrors remains as present as wind that howls through abandoned ruins of what was once called Maynard's Rest. In the end, only two things can be stated with absolute certainty about the winter of 1872 at Maynard's Rest. 97 human beings sought shelter within its walls, driven by desperation and the promise of warmth against the killing cold. The Maynard family vanished into the mountain wilderness, leaving behind evidence of systematic murder on a scale that challenged every assumption about frontier hospitality and human nature. Everything else remains locked in speculation and shadow. The exact methods of killing, the precise locations where bodies were processed, the ultimate fate of the Maynards themselves, all exist in the realm of educated conjecture based on fragmentary evidence and witness testimony. But the most important certainty is found in the fundamental meaning of these crimes. The Maynard Inn represents the logical extreme of frontier pragmatism, where the mathematics of survival reduced human life to its most basic components. In a place where civilization had worn thin as mountain air, a family discovered that hospitality could become harvest, that guests could become sustenance, and that murder could masquerade as business necessity. The horror lies not in Gothic details of processing equipment and bone meal fertilizer, but in the systematic nature of the enterprise. This was not madness or desperate cannibalism born of starvation. This was calculated business practice, where human beings were converted into renewable resources with methodical efficiency. The Maynards had created a closed-loop system where victims literally sustained operations, where each new guest represented both paying customer and future inventory. The inn became a Venus flytrap designed for human prey, its warm windows a beacon that drew the desperate to their doom. What makes the case particularly disturbing is not just its scale, but its invisibility. For months, systematic murder proceeded without detection, hidden by geographic isolation and weather conditions that made investigation impossible. The Maynards operated with impunity because they had correctly calculated that winter would provide both victims and concealment. The official response, with its deliberate suppression of evidence and sanitization of the historical record, adds another layer of horror. The territorial government's decision to bury truth rather than confront implications reveals how institutional power becomes complicit in evil through willful ignorance and political calculation. If you've made it this far into this story, consider subscribing to hear more accounts of the darkness that lurks in forgotten corners of history. Because the capacity for evil that manifested at Maynard's Rest was not unique to that time and place. The snows come every winter to the high country, and the wind still howls through abandoned ruins where hospitality once masked the harvest of human lives. The truth remains that wherever isolation meets desperation, wherever oversight fails and accountability disappears, the fundamental capacity for systematic evil persists, as surely as winter returns to the mountains each year.